Kestrel's war paint still dripped crimson down his chest when he found her stumbling through the thorn mesquite, her pale dress torn to ribbons and her golden hair wild as prairie grass in a storm. She spun toward him with desperate blue eyes. A broken branch clutched like a weapon in her trembling hands, and something primal roared to life in his blood, something that had nothing to do with war and everything to do with the way her breath caught when their gazes locked. "Stay back," Cordelia gasped, though her voice betrayed her breathless, not with fear, but with something darker, more dangerous. She'd been running for 2 days from the burned remains of Millfield Settlement, surviving on creek water and wild berries, but now, facing this bronze-skinned warrior with obsidian eyes that seemed to see straight through her soul, she felt more alive than she had in her entire 23 years of proper living. Kestrel raised his hand slowly, speaking in accented English that rolled like thunder across summer plains. "I will not harm you, white woman, but others will. Come, soldiers, bounty hunters. They track you like wolves track wounded deer." The branch fell from her nerveless fingers. "How do you know they're hunting me?" His smile was sharp as flint. "Because I have been watching you for 2 days. Watching you drink from poisoned streams, eat berries that would kill a lesser woman, fight through country that breaks seasoned. Warriors." He stepped closer, close enough that she could smell sage smoke and leather on his skin. "You interest me, Cordelia Ravencrest." Her surname on his lips sent lightning down her spine. "You know my name." "I know many things about the schoolteacher who burned down her own settlement rather than let the corrupt sheriff sell children to slavers." His dark eyes glittered with something between admiration and hunger. "I know you killed 3 men that night before you ran." The truth hung between them like smoke. Cordelia lifted her chin defiantly. They deserved worse. Kestrel's pulse quickened. Here was no simpering frontier maiden, but a woman with fire in her belly and blood on her hands. A woman who matched the wildness he'd been born to. "The soldiers will be here before sunset. Come with me." "Why would you help me?" He reached out slowly, his calloused fingers barely brushing her cheek, and felt her sharp intake of breath. The contact burned through him like whiskey. "Because I cannot control myself around you, and I would see what happens when I stop trying." Without waiting for her answer, he swept her up in his arms, ignoring her startled cry. Her body fit against his like she was carved for him, soft curves pressed to hard muscle, her heartbeat racing against his chest. As he carried her toward his horse, a magnificent black stallion that pawed the earth impatiently, Cordelia found herself staring at the strong line of his jaw, the proud set of his shoulders. "Put me down," she whispered, but her arms wound around his neck of their own accord. "No," he said simply, and lifted her onto the horse before swinging up behind her. His arms came around her waist, holding her secure against him as they rode toward the distant mesas. "You are mine now, Cordelia Ravencrest. Mine to protect, mine to keep warm by my fire." The words should have terrified her. Instead, as the wind whipped her hair and the powerful rhythm of the horse carried them toward unknown country, she felt something wild and desperate unfurl in her chest, a recognition that her old life was ashes behind her, and whatever lay ahead would burn just as bright. Kestrel's camp nestled in a hidden canyon where ancient cliff dwellings watched over a spring-fed pool that reflected stars like scattered diamonds. He set Cordelia down beside his fire with careful hands, though every instinct screamed at him to pull her close, to taste those soft lips that had been driving him mad for the past 4 hours of hard riding. "You live alone out here?" Cordelia asked, wrapping her torn shawl tighter as she studied the neat arrangements of weapons. The carefully banked fire, the sleeping furs spread invitingly near the warmth. "I choose solitude." Kestrel knelt to add mesquite wood to the flames, hyper-aware of how the firelight painted gold across her skin. "My people cast me out 3 winters past for loving where I should not have loved." The admission hung between them like a challenge. Cordelia sank gracefully onto a flat boulder, studying his profile in the dancing light. "What did you do?" "I took the wife of a war chief," his hand stilled on the kindling. "She came to me willingly, begged me to steal her away, but when her husband discovered us... He shrugged, but she saw the old pain flicker across his features. Honor demanded blood. I gave them exile instead. And the woman?" Kestrel's jaw tightened. "She chose duty over love. Stayed with her husband, bore him sons, never looked at me again." He turned those burning dark eyes on her. "I swore I would never again want what I could not have." Cordelia's pulse hammered. "Then why bring me here?" He rose slowly, moving toward her with predatory grace. "Because you are not another man's wife. You are a wanted woman with blood on her hands and nowhere else to run." He stopped just close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his gaze. "Because when I touch you, you do not pull away." As if to prove his point, his fingers traced the line of her jaw, and she leaned into the caress despite herself. Heat bloomed through her body, pooling low in her belly as his thumb brushed across her lower lip. "I should be afraid of you," she whispered. "Yes," he agreed, his voice rough with want. "But you are not." Before she could respond, he pulled her to her feet, his hands spanning her waist as he lifted her easily. Her palms flattened against his chest, feeling the rapid beat of his heart beneath bronze skin. The firelight painted them both in gold and shadow as he searched her face for any sign of fear, of rejection. Instead, she rose on her toes and kissed him. The contact exploded through them both like lightning striking dry timber. Kestrel groaned against her mouth, his arms crushing her against him as 3 years of forced celibacy and 2 days of burning want collided in a storm of desperate need. Cordelia kissed him back with equal hunger, her fingers tangling in his long black hair as she pressed herself against the hard planes of his body. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, his forehead rested against hers. "The soldiers will come looking," she said softly. "Let them come." His hands moved to the ties of her tattered dress. "Tonight, there is only this fire and you and what burns between us." Cordelia felt the last of her civilized restraint crumble as his lips found the sensitive spot where her neck met her shoulder. Tomorrow might bring pursuit, violence, death, but tonight she would take what this wild country offered. Tonight she would let herself burn. "Show me," she breathed against his ear, and felt his whole body shudder with want. The fire crackled higher as if in response, casting dancing shadows on the canyon walls that had witnessed 1,000 similar surrenders across the centuries. Captain Mordecai Flint spat tobacco juice into the dust and squinted at the tracks leading toward Apache country, his weathered face twisted with the kind of fury that had made him infamous from Fort Laramie to the Rio Grande. Behind him, 20 hard-bitten cavalry soldiers sat their horses with the easy patience of men who had spent their lives killing. "She's riding double," reported Sergeant Kane, a scarred man whose left eye had been carved out by a Comanche lance. "Fresh horse unshod, Indian pony." Flint's smile was all teeth and malice. "So the little schoolmarm found herself a redskin protector. Makes this more interesting." He turned in his saddle to address his men. "Remember, boys, we need the woman alive. She's got information about certain... business arrangements that some important folks in the territorial capital would prefer stayed buried." What he didn't mention was his personal stake in Cordelia Ravencrest's capture. She'd seen too much that night in Millfield, knew too much about his side dealings in human cargo. Worse, she'd humiliated him, burned down his carefully constructed network of corruption in one blazing act of defiance. Meanwhile, 50 miles deeper into the wild country, Kestrel felt the approach of danger like a change in the wind. He'd been teaching Cordelia to track game when the sensation hit him, the crawling awareness between his shoulder blades that meant enemies were closing in. "We need to move," he said quietly, his hand automatically checking the knife at his belt. Cordelia straightened from examining deer prints in the soft earth, instantly alert. 3 days of living wild had stripped away the last veneer of civilized softness, revealing the steel beneath. Her hair hung in a long braid down her back, her skin had bronzed under the desert sun, and she moved with newfound grace through country that would have killed her a week ago. "How many?" she asked, trusting his instincts completely. 20, maybe more. Kestrel's eyes swept the horizon, calculating distances, escape routes, advantages. "They are good trackers, but they think like soldiers, straight lines, overwhelming force. We will give them shadows and stone." They broke camp with practiced efficiency, Cordelia rolling their few supplies while Kestrel scattered the ashes of their fire and obscured their tracks. But as they prepared to mount his stallion, she caught his arm. "Kestrel." Her voice was steady, but he heard the fear beneath. "What if they catch us?" He turned to face her fully, his hands cupping her face with infinite gentleness. "They will not take you alive. I swear this on my grandfather's bones." The promise should have terrified her, but instead it filled her with fierce gratitude. She had chosen her path when she burned Millfield, and she would not be dragged back to face a corrupt justice that would protect the very men she'd tried to stop. "And if they kill you?" she asked. His smile was sharp and wild. "Then you run, woman with fire hair. You run to the sacred caves in the high country where even the army fears to go, and you live free as the wind." Before she could protest, he lifted her onto the stallion and swung up behind her. As they rode toward the maze of canyons that would hide their passage, Cordelia leaned back against his chest and felt his arms tighten around her. 3 days ago, she had been a proper schoolteacher in a dying settlement. Now she was an outlaw woman riding with an Apache warrior toward an uncertain future, and the transformation felt as natural as breathing. Behind them, gust clouds marked their pursuers' approach, but ahead lay country that would test every man. "Jack of them." Kestrel's lips brushed her ear as he whispered, "Hold tight, Wildcat. The real hunt is just beginning." The stallion stretched into a ground-eating lope, carrying them toward the badlands where only the strong survived and the weak fed the buzzards. The arrow took Sergeant Kane through the throat as he bent to examine their tracks at the narrow mouth of Devil's Canyon. He toppled from his saddle without a sound, blood frothing pink on his lips as 20 rifles swung toward the cliff faces that rose like cathedral walls on either side. "Ambush!" Captain Flint roared, but his voice was swallowed by the thunder of war cries echoing off stone as painted warriors materialized from impossibly small crevices in the rock. Not Apache Comanche, their traditional enemies, painted for war and hungry for cavalry scalps. From his position high on the canyon rim, Kestrel watched the slaughter with grim satisfaction. He had tracked the war party for 2 days, leading Flint's men straight into their path like sheep to slaughter. The irony was perfect. White soldiers who hunted Apache would die by Comanche lance, and both his enemies would bleed each other. White. "Brilliant," Cordelia breathed beside him, her eyes bright with savage appreciation as she watched Flint's carefully ordered formation dissolve into chaos. 3 days of living wild had awakened something primal in the former schoolteacher, something that gloried in the destruction of the corrupt men who had driven her from civilization. Kestrel's satisfaction curdled when he spotted movement. On the far rim, a lone figure in cavalry blue, raising a mirror to flash signals toward the desert beyond. A survivor from an advance scout calling for reinforcements. "We go now," he said tersely, pulling her back from the edge. "More soldiers. Come." They had barely reached their hidden camp when the earth began to shake with the thunder of approaching hooves. Not 20 men this time, but a full troop, 60 seasoned Indian fighters led by a man Kestrel recognized with cold dread, Colonel Jasper Ironwood, the butcher of Sand Creek, a man who had made his reputation burning Apache villages and selling the survivors to Mexican slavers. "They have us trapped," Cordelia said quietly, watching the dust cloud approach. "Don't they?" Kestrel's face was carved from stone. Yes, she studied his profile, seeing the wheels turning behind those dark eyes. "You're thinking of surrendering. Trading yourself for my freedom." The thought had occurred to me. No, the word cracked like a whip. She spun to face him, her hands fisting in the front of his shirt. "I didn't burn my whole world down just to watch you sacrifice yourself for a woman you've known less than a week. You do not understand." "I understand perfectly." Her eyes blazed with the same fire that had driven her to kill 3 men and torch Millfield settlement. "I understand that I love you, Kestrel of the Chiricahua. I understand that I would rather die fighting beside you than live without you." The words hit him like physical blows. In 3 years of exile, no woman had looked at him with anything but fear or calculation. But this golden-haired wildcat spoke of love as casually as other women discussed the weather and meant every burning word. "Cordelia, no." She kissed him hard, desperate, tasting salt tears on both their lips. "If this is our last hour, then make it count." The thunder of hooves was growing closer, but Kestrel pulled her against him anyway, his mouth moving over hers with desperate hunger. Her body molded to his like she was made for him, soft curves fitting against hard angles as if they were 2 pieces of the same soul. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, she saw her own wild resolve reflected in his dark eyes. "Then we go down fighting," he said simply. She smiled, and it was terrible and beautiful. Together. From the desert floor came the blare of cavalry trumpets and Colonel Ironwood's parade ground bellow. "Apache, dog. Send out the woman and we'll make your death quick." Kestrel's answering war cry rang off the canyon walls like the scream of an eagle, and Cordelia felt her blood sing in response. They had perhaps an hour before the soldiers found their position, but it would be enough to show these uniformed murderers what happened when they cornered 2 people who had nothing left to lose but each other. Colonel Ironwood's men came up the narrow canyon trail like blue ants, their carbines glinting in the afternoon sun as they advanced in textbook formation. They moved with the confidence of veterans who had broken Apache resistance from the Mogollon Rim to the Mexican border, expecting to face desperate fugitives armed with desperation and little else. They had no idea. They were walking into hell. Kestrel's first shot took the lead sergeant through the chest, the heavy .44 slug punching him backward off the trail to crash among the rocks 40 feet below. Before the echo of the gunshot had faded, Cordelia's rifle spoke from her position across the narrow canyon, and another trooper pitched forward with a scream that cut off abruptly. "2 rifles!" someone shouted. "The woman's armed!" More shouts rose from below as the soldiers scrambled for cover, but the canyon walls offered precious little protection. Kestrel and Cordelia had chosen their positions with deadly calculation crossfire lanes that turned the approach into a killing ground, with no way forward and a long, exposed retreat. Flush them out. Ironwood bellowed from his position well behind the advance. "I want that woman alive." Private Hutchins, barely 19 and 3 weeks out from Fort Union, found himself pressed against a boulder while bullets chipped stone inches from his head. He joined the army to see the frontier, to make something of himself beyond the hardscrabble farm where he'd been born. Instead, he was trapped in a hellish canyon watching good men die, and for what? One escaped woman? Above them, Cordelia worked her rifle's lever action with mechanical precision, each shot carefully aimed and devastatingly effective. The Springfield rifle Kestrel had taken from a dead cavalryman 2 years past was a beautiful weapon in the hands of someone who'd grown up hunting to keep her family fed. These soldiers were just larger game. "I count 14 down," she called to Kestrel during a lull as the survivors hugged their meager cover. 16, he corrected, his voice calm as if they were discussing the weather. "But they will try to flank us soon. Watch the left ridge." As if summoned by his words, movement flickered among the rocks to their north. A squad of troopers was working their way up a secondary trail, trying to get above the ambush site. Kestrel's rifle spoke twice in rapid succession, and 2 figures tumbled from the heights, but more kept coming. "We cannot hold this position much longer," he admitted. Cordelia's laugh was wild and free. "Then let's give them something to remember us by." She reached into her pack and withdrew one of the bottles of grain alcohol they'd taken from an abandoned trading post. A torn piece of her petticoat served as a wick, and Kestrel's flint and steel provided the flame. "Fire in the hole," she called cheerfully, and lobbed the improvised bomb down into the advancing soldiers. The explosion echoed like thunder between the canyon walls, followed by screams as burning alcohol splashed across 3 men. The advance faltered as soldiers beat at flames that clung like napalm, and in that moment of chaos, Kestrel made his decision. "There is a way," he said quietly, "a path known only to my grandfather's people. But it means leaving everything behind, no turning back, no return to the world of white men or Apache." Cordelia reloaded her rifle with practiced movements, her face serene despite the bullets whining overhead. "I burned my bridges the night I torched Millfield. The only world I want is the one that has you in it." He looked at her then, this woman, who had transformed from prim school teacher to deadly warrior in the space of a week, and felt something shift in his chest. Love, yes, but more than that, recognition. She was his match in every way that mattered, his equal in courage and ferocity. "Then come," he said, shouldering his rifle. "The sacred caves lie 3 miles north, through country that will break. Most of these soft soldiers, those who survive, will not follow us into the holy places." As if to emphasize his words, another of Cordelia's fire bottles exploded among the rocks below, sending soldiers scurrying like disturbed ants. She grinned at him, gunpowder smoke streaking her face like war paint. "Lead the way, my love." They slipped away from their positions like smoke, leaving behind 37 dead and wounded cavalrymen, a furious colonel, and a legend that would grow with each telling around frontier campfires for decades to come. The caves opened like mouths in the cliff face, breathing cool air that carried the scent of ancient ceremonies and older mysteries. Kestrel led Cordelia through passages that narrowed and widened according to no earthly logic, past walls painted with handprints and hunting scenes older than memory. "Your people made these paintings?" she asked, her voice hushed by the cathedral atmosphere of the deep caverns. "These people were here before Apache, before Comanche, before the first white man crossed the Great Water." Kestrel's torch flickered against walls covered in spirals and strange symbols that seemed to shift in the dancing light. "My grandfather brought me here as a boy, said this was where the earth dreams." They emerged into a vast chamber lit by shafts of golden sunlight streaming through cracks in the ceiling far above. An underground river murmured along one wall, feeding pools that reflected the light like scattered jewels. The air hummed with an energy that raised the fine hairs on Cordelia's arms. "It's beautiful," she breathed, then stopped as she saw what occupied the center of the chamber. Skeletons sat in a perfect circle around a ring of fire-blackened stones, their bones white as ivory in the filtered sunlight. Men, women, children, an entire tribe that had chosen death in their sacred place rather than surrender to some forgotten enemy. "They died free," Kestrel said simply, "as we will die free when our time comes." Cordelia moved among the ancient remains with respectful silence, seeing in their arrangement something that transcended mere death. These people had faced extinction with dignity, choosing their own ending rather than accepting slavery or displacement. "How long do we have?" she asked. Kestrel knelt by the river and drank, then splashed the cold water over his face and chest. "Ironwood will not follow us into the sacred caves. His men are too superstitious, and he has lost too many already. But he will wait at the canyon mouth, starve us out. Or try to." She joined him by the water, kneeling to drink from cupped hands. The water was sweet and cold, tasting of minerals and deep earth. When she looked up, Kestrel was watching her, with an expression she couldn't quite read. "What is it, you?" He reached out to touch her face with wondering fingers. "A week ago you were a schoolteacher in a dying settlement. Now you kneel beside Apache bones and speak of death as calmly as you once discussed lessons." Cordelia caught his hand and pressed it flat against her cheek. "A week ago I was half dead inside, going through the motions of a life that meant nothing. You woke something in me, Kestrel. Something wild and fierce that was always there, just waiting." She kissed his palm, then bit it gently, her eyes never leaving his. "I am more myself with you than I ever was in all my 23 years of civilized living." The last of his restraint snapped like an overstretched rope. He pulled her against him, his mouth crushing down on hers with desperate hunger. She responded with equal fierce need, her hands fisting in his hair as she poured all her love and want and defiance into the kiss. They made love on their spread blankets beside the underground river, surrounded by the bones of ancient warriors and the whispered echoes of older mysteries. Their passion was wild and desperate and utterly without shame. Two souls recognizing their perfect match even as the world tried to tear them apart. Afterward, lying tangled together in the golden light, Cordelia traced lazy patterns on Kestrel's chest and felt more at peace than she had since childhood. "Do you think they're watching?" she asked, nodding toward the circle of bones. Kestrel's arms tightened around her. "I think they understand. Love like this, love that burns everything. Elsewhere they died for something like this. Then we're in good company." Outside, thunder rumbled across the desert as storm clouds gathered for the first rain in 3 months. Inside the sacred chamber, two fugitives held each other close and prepared to make their last stand worthy of legend. Colonel Ironwood's patience finally broke on the 7th day. The storm that had been building all week unleashed its fury just as he gave the order to advance into the sacred caves, his remaining soldiers reluctantly following their commander into passages that seemed to swallow light and sound with equal hunger. Lightning split the desert sky as the first troopers emerged into the great chamber, their rifles raised and ready for the final confrontation. What they found instead stopped them cold. 30 pounds of stolen cavalry gunpowder arranged around the ancient fire ring, with a simple fuse leading back toward the shadows where 2 pairs of eyes gleamed like stars. "Halt!" Ironwood barked, but his voice cracked with sudden understanding. "You'll bring down the whole damned mountain." Kestrel stepped into the light, magnificent and terrible in his war paint, one hand resting casually on the burning fuse that would send them all to whatever gods waited beyond death. Beside him, Cordelia stood proud as any Apache warrior woman, her golden hair blazing in the torchlight like a crown of flame. "Yes," Kestrel said simply, "we will." The fuse sparked and hissed, eating its way toward certain destruction with mechanical precision. Ironwood's men began backing toward the passage, their faces pale with the special terror reserved for soldiers who suddenly found themselves trapped with nothing but bad choices. "Wait," the colonel shouted desperately. "Name your terms." "Whatever. You want money, safe passage, full pardons." Cordelia's laugh rang off the chamber walls like silver bells. "You think we want to bargain with men who buy and sell children, who burn settlements to hide their crimes?" She shook her head, her eyes bright with savage joy. "We want something you can never give us, Colonel. We want justice." Thunder crashed overhead as if the very heavens agreed with her words, and rain began to pour through the ceiling cracks in torrents that had not been seen in years of drought. The drops hissed and steamed where they struck the ancient bones, and suddenly the air itself seemed to shimmer with otherworldly energy. Private Hutchins, pressed against the chamber wall and watching his life count down in sparks and flame, found himself thinking of his sister back in Kansas, of wildflowers and spring meadows, of all the things he would never see again. Around him, hardened veterans prayed to gods they had ignored for decades, while their commanding officer calculated angles and distances with the desperate precision of a man trying to cheat death itself. But Kestrel and Cordelia had eyes only for each other. In the face of certain annihilation, they found perfect peace in each other's gaze, their hands clasped tight as lovers throughout history had faced their final moments. "Do you regret it?" he asked softly. "Choosing this path?" "Never." She rose on her toes to kiss him one last time, tasting salt tears and wild joy on both their lips. "I love you, Kestrel of the Chiricahua, in this life and whatever comes after." The fuse burned low, sparking against the first charge, and the world held its breath. But instead of annihilation, the rain pouring through the ceiling struck the powder with such force that it scattered the charges, drowning the fuses in a torrent that transformed the ancient fire ring into a rushing stream. What should have been their funeral pyre became instead a baptism of wild water that washed away gunpowder and death alike. In the stunned silence that followed, Cordelia began to laugh. Not the bitter laughter of defeat, but pure joy bubbling up from some deep spring of the soul. She tilted her face to the falling rain and spread her arms wide, spinning like a child in the cleansing downpour. "Even the spirits want us to live." She called to Kestrel, and he found himself laughing too, caught up in her wild delight despite the circle of rifles still trained on them. Colonel Ironwood stood frozen, water dripping from his campaign hat as he tried to process what had just happened. His carefully planned capture had become a farce, his overwhelming force reduced to 37 soggy soldiers, standing in a cave full of bones and miracles. That was when the passage behind them erupted with war cries in a dozen different languages: Apache, Comanche, Navajo, even a few renegade Mexicans, all united by hatred for the blue-coated army that had burned their homes and scattered their peoples. Kestrel's message fires, lit during the week-long siege, had finally borne fruit. Ironwood. The voice belonged to Mangas, war chief of the Mescalero Apache and Kestrel's cousin. "You are surrounded and your ammunition is wet. Surrender now, and we will give you the death of a warrior. Fight, and we will give you to the women for their amusement." The remaining cavalry soldiers looked at their weapons, then at the rain still pouring through the ceiling, then at the growing crowd of painted warriors blocking their only escape. Mathematics was a cruel science, and the equation was simple. Wet powder plus overwhelming force equals inevitable defeat. Colonel Ironwood's surrender, when it came, was delivered through gritted teeth and a face purple with rage. But he was soldier enough to know when the game was over, and proud enough to spare his men the butchery that would follow if he chose. Stupid heroics over pragmatic survival. As the disarmed soldiers were led away to face tribal justice, Kestrel and Cordelia stood alone in the sacred chamber, still holding hands as rain continued to fall like blessings from above. "What happens now?" she asked, watching the last of the cavalry disappear into the tunnels. Kestrel smiled, and for the first time since she'd known him, it held nothing but joy. "Now we go home. There is a place in the high country where the army never goes, where my grandfather's people still live free. We will build a cabin by the stream where the trout are fat and lazy, and you will teach the children to read, and I will teach them to hunt, and we will grow old together." "Very old," he promised. and kissed her as the storm raged overhead, and the ancient spirits of the cave sang their approval in voices like wind through stone. Years later, when frontier newspapers ran breathless accounts of the mysterious couple who had defied the U.S. Army and vanished into legend, they would speak of the Apache warrior and his golden-haired woman as if they were figures from mythology rather than flesh and blood. But in a hidden valley where eagles nested and wildflowers bloomed in impossible profusion, Kestrel and Cordelia lived and loved and raised children who grew up bilingual in English and Apache, educated in both Shakespeare and ancient hunting songs. They built a life that was wild and free and utterly their own, proving that sometimes love really could conquer all, especially when it was backed up by superior firepower and divine intervention. And if the rain still fell a little harder in that particular valley, and if the hunting was always good, and if travelers sometimes reported seeing lights dancing among the ancient ruins on certain moonless nights, well, the desert keeps its secrets, and some stories are too precious to be completely true. But those who knew them best swore that even in their 70s, Kestrel and Cordelia would disappear into the wilderness for weeks at a time, coming back with eyes bright as stars and smiles that spoke of mysteries older than civilization itself. After all, some fires never burn out, they just learn to burn deeper, hotter, and more beautifully with each passing year.